Support for this podcast comes from listeners like you. Your contribution helps to cover the many costs associated with the production and post-production of the podcast. This is an ad-free show and donations are greatly appreciated. To make a one-time donation in any amount that you desire or make a monthly donation, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. It means the world to me. I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach, and on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, understanding anxiety. Like many people, I have struggled with anxiety, at times severely. I have read many books on the topic, interviewed experts on the show, and learned as much as I could. But recently, I came across a new book that completely changed my understanding of anxiety. It's called Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide. This book is different. I not only enjoyed it immensely, as it's written with such eloquence, but also found it extremely enlightening and helpful. It offers a fresh philosophical understanding of anxiety. It's compelling, poignant, deep, and thought-provoking. I particularly enjoyed the author's personal stories, which are quite moving and relatable for me personally. Samir Chopra is a philosophical counselor and professor emeritus of philosophy at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His academic interests include pragmatism, Nietzsche, the philosophical and legal foundations of artificial intelligence, philosophy of law, and the politics and ethics of technology. At times difficult and emotional, today's conversation may not be everyone's cup of tea. I acknowledge that, but I encourage you, nevertheless, to stay present and curious and explore what might show up for you. Because ultimately, it's a conversation about what it means to love. I hope this episode will add a new layer in aiding you to reflect, reconsider, and reconceptualize anxiety. I am often asked by my listeners about my favorite episodes or guests. While it's hard to choose, this episode is the type of conversation that stays with me, impacts me, and changes me. We don't have to be anxious about being anxious. Embracing our anxiety can be a portal to self-discovery and freedom. Please enjoy. I want to just jump and read something from your book that hit me so hard. Let's see. The day my daughter was born, I rejoiced, even as I acknowledged facts almost too painful for me to make note of here, that I cannot prevent her from suffering loss and despair of her own, that none of the force of my parental love and longing can change the nature of the world she has been born into, and finally, and shatteringly, that she too will pass someday. I hope I will not be alive then, even as I realize that in so hoping, I am hoping only one of us will have to bear the pain of the other's passing. Oh my gosh, that's so deep and profound. I'm sorry, I teared up and I see you are emotional too, but that's the truth, right?
It's a really hard truth. And I think part of the thing with anxiety is that we are trying to avoid certain kinds of hard truths. But some part of our mind knows that those things are true. They are facts that we cannot change about the world. And so I think that effort that we exert to kind of not remember these things, to run away from them, to cover up that pain that is coming, I think that causes us anxiety in some ways. It can become the source of a lot of unease that we have with existence, because we know that underlying all of this are some really brute facts. I'm a middle-aged man. I am 57. I know that from now till the end of my life, I will get messages every few months that someone has got cancer, someone is terminally ill, someone is passing away. There are many people who I love and who I worry about, whose news I will receive one after the other. And this is just a fact. There's nothing I can do about it. And it doesn't really matter how rich or powerful I can make myself. I can get all the money in the world, all the power in the world. I can write the world's most best-selling books, but I will not be able to save myself from that news. And I think that reconciliation is really hard. I think dealing with my daughter's mortality is it's one of those facts. I think it's something that all parents have to know, that you cannot protect your children as much as you want to. And yeah, thank you for noticing that.
I know there's so many things I noticed in this book, and I read it so rapidly. I just recently acquired the book. I was in my local bookstore and I'm like, anxiety. I need to read this book. And I'm like, philosophical guide. I really need to read this book. Then when I opened the first few pages, I read it, I said, I need to have this guest on the podcast. That's how it goes for me. And of course, you generously accept it. And I am so nervous because there are so many things that I want to cover. There's so many little things like that I highlighted. Obviously, I don't think I can get to all of them, but I want to begin by asking you about the devotion page. You devoted the book to Noor and Ayana, who delivered me from fear. I feel like there's a whole story tucked into that one expression, a rich story. Do you want to say a few things about that? Are they your parents?
No, that's my wife and my daughter.
Uh-huh.
And I think I dedicated to them, or as you put it, devoted the book to them, because it's something I came to as I was writing the book. And I think if I was to talk more about the book as the book has been released, I will talk about this, which is that I realized that love is something that's very central to my understanding now of my mental well-being. And I think I've actually come to a deeper understanding of even religious feeling as a result of this, how important love is, how in some ways a lot of what we call anxiety is a kind of fear of the loss of love. And it can be fear of the loss of love. For religious people, it can be fear of the loss of love of God, that God will stop loving us, that his beneficence will no longer shine down upon us. It can be fear of the loss of love of some kind of abstract existential cosmic authority, that they will disapprove of the way I'm living my life. So every decision becomes fraught with anxiety because I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Or it can become anxiety because I might lose the love of my loved ones, my parents, my friends. I dare not speak my mind because people might reject me, or I might not, if I lose this job, people will stop loving me. And so that really came to me as I was writing the book, that we are, and in my work as a philosophical counselor, that we all are in some ways looking for love, and we're anxious about the loss of love. And I realized that my wife and my daughter, by coming into my life, by being present in my life, and after, losing my parents in the way that I did, I really felt bereft in some ways. And so I feel like I even found it hard to accept love that came my way. But I think being with my wife, we've been together for 20 years now, has been the biggest challenge of my life. It's been hard work, but it's been so valuable. I wouldn't trade it for anything else. And the same way with my daughter. My daughter coming into this world made me more brave, because to take on love is to take a chance of loss. So in some way, you make yourself braver by falling in love. To fall in love, to be in love, is an act of courage. And so by choosing to be in love, to choosing to stay in love, to love my wife, to love my daughter, it was an act of courage. I don't know how else to put it. And so I'm thankful to them for giving me a chance to love and to become braver as a result. I really feel like I've become a braver person since my daughter has been born. I have done things that would terrify me because I want her to be brave and strong. So I have to be brave and strong. So that means that she's good for me. She's made me into a better and braver person as a result. So I think that's why I dedicated the book to them, because they make it all possible.
Yeah, I can relate so deeply to what you're saying. I have become brave too. I think it is a brave act to love because you're gonna lose. That's just a fact of life, and especially when you bring that life to life, right? Like we bring our children into this world. I think that consciousness for me is even deeper because like losing our parents is another thing. We love them, but this one is we're sort of responsible for bringing them into this world. And when we lose, I think it's even more painful. I don't know. That's how I think about it. When I lost my dad now 3 years ago, actually, yesterday was the third anniversary. But in my mind, it's like 2 years. It was 3 years ago when I lost my dad. I realized for the first time that void, that aloneness, because he was my only living parent, right? And like you, I lost my mom. You lost your dad when you were 12. I lost my mom when I was 13. So discovering this new role, this new state of being an orphan in the world as a grown up, that having no protection, feeling the vulnerability of this fragile existence, the void, that I am next, my mortality, it all came into sharp focus for me for the first time. And I wanted to talk about it so badly, but so many people could not relate to it. I remember I shared on the podcast for the first time, and I'm like, I don't know if this is even normal to talk about this. But then I talked again, and the guest who also had lost her parents understood, and we had this interesting conversation. And then, because nobody talks about this, right? Then I read your book. I'm like, wow, like it validates this experience so much.
Thanks for saying that. For many, many years, especially because I'd lost my parents quite as early as I did, I felt myself to be a real stranger in this world. I often say that it's very hard for me to actually connect with people who have not lost at least one parent because I feel they inhabit some quite different metaphysical space from mine. They live in a different world. Materially, this world is the same, but I see the world through a very different emotional kind of lens or veil or whatever you want to call it. And I actually would feel shy talking about this because I really felt like a terrible curse had been visited upon me. So to talk about both my parents having passed away felt like I was telling someone that, I had failed an exam or that I had lost a limb or that I was horribly diseased in some way. It's not the kind of thing that you would bring up in polite company. And sometimes people would ask me and I would be like, oh, actually, my parents are not alive. And I used to always feel there was something disgraceful about this. And there's complicated emotions that go along with it. There's a tremendous sense of have suffered a lot from, I guess, rage or anger, which contributes to, the shadow of rage or anger is melancholia or depression. And you feel cheated because you walk down the road and you see people with their parents and people are getting their laundry done at their parents' homes. They're going home for Christmas and their children have both sets of grandparents. And I feel like I'm an outsider. I feel like I don't really belong in this world of normal people. And now that I have a daughter and she doesn't have two sets of grandparents, she only has one set of grandparents. Every day for me is like a reminder of this loss again and again and again. And I miss my parents terribly. Like I felt like, it's been 40 years since they passed away, but I miss them terribly. And I miss them precisely because I have a daughter. I wish my daughter had my mother as a grandmother. I wish my daughter had my father. So, thank you so much for saying that it was some kind of presence for you or a validation for you because I've not suffered, but I've really, really, really lacked that in my life. Like I just couldn't meet people. And I didn't want to go around saying, I want to meet people who have lost both parents. That sounds like such a morbid desire. But there was a part in me where I just felt like I don't understand people who haven't lost that much because I couldn't connect at some fundamental level.
And the strange thing is, the people who haven't lost their parents or anyone yet, they will, right? That anxiety that we all have is alive in them, except in us, it has opened up and revealed itself. For them, they are walking diluted and illusioned and, I don't know how you want to call it. For us, we can see that they are going to experience that too. And there is that innocence that we lost. I call it innocence, right? Because when you lose your parents, you're no longer a child anymore.
Yes, yes, you no longer are. And I think, since you mentioned to me that this is a parenting podcast, the one thing I remember thinking to my mind as I was coming into today was thinking about how that has informed the way I bring up my daughter. And it hit me. I was just literally, I've often said this, that the way I bring up my daughter is I have sought to bring up my daughter in such a way so that she can live without me.
I can relate to that too.
I would like her to be independent. I would like her to take care of herself, to not expect that every time she turns left or turns right or wants her parents that I or her mother will be there. It's almost like this something perverse about it. Like I'm bringing you up so that you don't need me. But to me, like that's the only way I can think about parenting, that I have to prepare her for this eventuality because I wasn't ready for it. And I quote unquote suffered, and she still will. If something would happen to me, she still will, but that doesn't stop me from thinking that I have to prepare her for that eventuality. So the parenting dictums that it translates into is encouraging independence or encouraging a certain kind of hopefully inner strength, hopefully, or resilience. I guess that's the right word. Teaching her to be resilient in some way. That has informed me throughout, right?
Yeah, I can relate. I parent in that way too, but I think no matter what, it's going to hit them. It's going to hit them in a hard way because we also love them, right? Unconditionally. And they will feel our absence.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how prepared they are, they will feel that we can never shield them from that pain.
Yeah. I think that's that knowledge that I think I was trying to get at in that first line that you quoted, that I feel it brutally, that I'm responsible for her. And yet I cannot prevent the worst kinds of feelings and emotions being experienced by her because that's the nature of our stay here in this world. There are just some really brutal, incontrovertible facts about our existence. And I think, to come back to all the way to anxiety, it's like the realization of that at some level in our minds contributes to a certain kind of level of anxiety that we feel throughout. And I think I came to this after a long time. I finally not understood, but like I came to grips with how these so many symptoms that I had in me, like I think that's why I said at one point I'm insecure, I'm distracted, I cannot concentrate on reading a book. And, some like nowadays we call it ADHD or ADD and all these names that we have given to various kinds of anxiety. They're a kind of, like I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't keep my mind on things. I was always worried in romantic relationships. I was always jealous. I mean, these are forms of anxieties. They're like fears of the loss of certain kinds of things. And it took me a long time to understand that there was some kind of fear of loss underwriting all of this. And there are different kinds of fears of loss, but they underwrite these various things which manifest themselves as so many different kinds of emotions or pathologies in the way that people like to think about them or talk about them.
Yeah, and this is why you helped me change my mind about anxiety. I was already thinking in the lines that I'm going to share, but your book crystallized that for me. I somehow also thought that, I think you write about this too, that certain traumas or losses cause anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking that too, because my anxiety, my panic attacks, I had panic attacks after my father passed, and I experienced severe anxiety that I never experienced before. But I also look back and I'm like, yeah, I was always a nervous, anxious kid, but I never experienced to that degree. And then I was contributing it to COVID because COVID brought up so much. It really traumatized. I was seeing anxiety as part of the trauma, the traumatic event, but your book helped me understand that no, anxiety is always present. It's always there, except maybe certain events make us be aware of that anxiety more. Right? Not that those traumas cause the anxiety. We're inherently born with this anxious state of being, right? It's part of our being human.
Yes. In fact, I would say, thanks for actually giving me that opening, because when you say it's part of being human, I think it's part of being a very particular kind of being, which is It lives in time. So there is a past, present, and future for this being. Also, this time is finite. And thirdly, this being is conscious of the fact that it lives in time and that this time is finite. So, because you could be a being that is finite and that lives in time, but is not conscious of the fact. So it basically lives from one moment to the other. But if you remember the past and you anticipate the future, but yet you are powerless to do anything about them comprehensively, like I cannot change the past and I cannot affect the future like fully. There's a sense in which I'm limited by my capacities. So the fact that I'm a limited being and yet conscious of these limitations makes me anxious because I know I cannot prevent bad things from happening to me tomorrow. And I cannot stop anticipating the future. I'm eager to know what will happen the next day. There are these lines from Kierkegaard that I quote in my chapter in Kierkegaard, where Kierkegaard says at one point, anxiety is the next day. Or he says, anxiety is nothing but impatience, right? I want to know what is going to happen, right? And that's why I have that line in there where I say, we want to live, but we're afraid of living, right? I mean, I'm like very keen to survive into the next day. And yet there is a part of me that is apprehensive about what the next day might bring. I use this morbid example all the time. And right now, there might be somebody drinking at a bar in Denver and getting drunk. And 5 hours later in the evening, when I drive out, that person will kill me in a drunk driving accident. I don't know. This might be happening right now. And I think this knowledge of the incompleteness of my knowledge also fills me with a certain kind of dread, right? I think this is why we have so many games. Why we're obsessed with astrology, we're obsessed with time machines, we're obsessed with dreams about the future. We want to know so badly what is going to happen to us. I mean, I think, astrology, fortune telling, these are all indications of a terrible anxiety within us. I really want to know, but you cannot. I don't care how powerful you are, you cannot. Sometimes I have these fantasies where I impute superpowers to myself, right? I'll suddenly be able to write a 500-page classic novel in 2 weeks' time, and I will be able to attract all the beautiful women of the world. Just imagine some superpower. Well, none of those superpowers, unless I make myself truly godlike, will give me omniscience or will give me the power to change the future in all the ways. They will not make me immortal. There's no getting away from this existential bind that we find ourselves in. And I think that's what I was getting at about the not being able to get away from anxiety, right?
Yeah, I mean, do you think we become acutely aware of this because we're in our middle ages?
It's a very interesting point because, towards the end of the book, I say that the midlife crisis is just another name for anxiety. And I fully believe that. I also believe that the midlife crisis can be a really good existential time because we come to understand that I think many people have commented on this, novelists and so on and so forth. It's that time in your life when you come to understand that many of the plans you had for your life are not going to happen. You understand your limitations very acutely. If you're smart, you start to resize and scale back horizons. You bring them closer to yourself. You start, like Voltaire, you start tending to the garden that is immediately at hand, right? There is a kind of prioritization of relationships and tasks. So the midlife time or the midlife crisis can also be can be a wonderfully productive and rewarding time if we are able to come to some philosophical grips with ourselves. So I do think that at this middle-age time, my anxieties are quite bad. I would say I'm a pretty anxious person, but I would also say that I have some kind of hard-earned wisdom about what I'm capable of and what I'm not capable of. I just returned from a trip to India where I met family of mine and I came back and I'm terribly, terribly, terribly homesick. I miss those people really badly. I feel terribly nostalgic. I don't know how much time I have left with them. And it's a crushing feeling to feel that people I love are so far away and I don't know how much time I have left with them. There's no other way to describe it. It feels like the weight of 1,000 tons on me. And that weight is so intense that sometimes I can almost barely breathe. But I know that there's nothing else to do but to just suffer it somehow and move on to the next hour, the next day, the next week.
Yeah, I mean, when you read facts like 40 million Americans are suffering from anxiety, or 20% of the population is anxious, they have anxiety disorders. Like when you hear facts like that, what do you think about anxiety?
It's a very good question. I think I always think something that is so diagnosed, so medicated, we should be curious as to, why it's so prevalent. Is it something about the world? Is it something about us? And the answer, as I note in my book, is that it's a combination of both, that we are bound to be anxious. We are given our constitutions, but also in some ways, it's something about the way in which we have organized the world, right? The way we have chosen to organize our societies, the way we have chosen to organize our lives. And also, I think deeply and fundamentally, perhaps one of the reasons we are so unhappy, so miserable, so anxious, so depressed, so medicated, is that we have somehow at some point received a message, maybe not through religion, but through other philosophies of life, through life mythologies, that the purpose of life is to seek happiness, that the purpose of life is to not be unhappy. And I think that, in my mind, is a problem. Because life isn't, I've come to this realization, the kind of thing that is going to give you happiness. So I think if we spend our lives trying to be happy, we're going to make ourselves unhappier. Perhaps if we accept that life has other fruits, something I say in my book, perhaps if we accept that the fruits of life are difficulty, challenges, sometimes insurmountable challenges. Sometimes life is about the acceptance of limitations and losses, so that when they come upon us, we don't find them as pathologies. We don't find them as imperfections or blemishes in my life that need to be removed. I come to accept my life as it is. So I think part of the reason I think that's why I have that punchline about, we don't have to be anxious about being anxious, is that I think the same thing applies to happiness. We don't have to be unhappy about not being happy all the time. I think we get these messages you can fix all your problems and here's 7 tips for doing so. And here's this self-help book that's going to tell you to be happy. Maybe life isn't the kind of thing that makes us that happy, and maybe that's what makes us unhappy instead.
I mean, you're talking about the current culture. I mean, this obsession of optimizing our health, our everything, aging backward, for staying young forever. This obsession is incredible. In fact, yesterday I was, searching your name in YouTube, and a video popped up. It says, this 91-year-old woman looks 56, and look how she's, defying age and this and that. I'm like, why do we want to be exposed to this garbage? She looks like so much Botox and surgery has been done. What are we selling to people? And what is this obsession for staying young, being young, and manipulating our bodies? And it's just insane. Why are we so afraid?
I agree with that. And I think you see it in the kinds of instructions we are given for maximizing productivity, how to best use our time. I think even slogans, things like live each day to its fullest, those are tremendously anxiety provoking. Why should I live each day to the fullest? What does that even mean? I have no idea what it means. Does it mean that I should try and do a lot of things? Should I have a bucket list in my life of 17 things to visit before I go, 19 most beautiful places, or the 100 top books I need to read? Because the moment you have bucket lists, and the Buddha could have told you this thousands of years ago, the only thing you will get upon completing that bucket list will be a sense of ennui, just now what? I got the fucking bucket list done. Big deal. Now what? And if you don't complete the bucket list, then you have a sense of existential failure. Oh, I didn't get the bucket list done. So you are bound to lose either way. Finish the bucket list, you feel ennui. Don't feel the bucket list, you feel guilt, right? So maybe part of the problem is that we think that life is a journey, right? Because if life is a journey, then I'm always concerned about destinations. Where am I going? Am I on time? Will I get there on time? Will I get to the right destination? Maybe I'm going to make the wrong fork, right? And of course, then we get all these instructional manuals, how to best make use of your time, how to make sure you will get to the right destination. This is why we have so many religious books of instruction. They're all maps for the world. They're telling me how to navigate, right? And this makes us think that there's a right map out there somewhere, and I need to get my hands on it somehow. Or maybe there isn't. Maybe this is just a trackless land, and we run into fellow travelers, and they don't know any better than me what lies out there beyond the swirling mists. Every once in a while, some other traveler comes back through the mist and hands me a book and says, "This is what I have learned through my travels." Right. And I say, "Oh, thank you so much. Now I have this amazing instruction manual." I mean, all the prophets, that's all they've ever done. They've just come back and told us what they saw. Jesus, Muhammad, all these guys, they were telling us what they saw, but they were humans like me, you know? I don't know. And I think the fear that I might be missing out on some right way of dealing with this world makes us so anxious, that I will get it wrong somehow. Maybe there isn't anything to get wrong.
Yeah, we're already fundamentally vulnerable and anxious. Why contribute more anxiety, right?
Yeah, I think I realized many of the things that are supposed to make us less anxious actually make us more anxious. Even like time is running out, life is short, live it to its fullest. I'm like, oh my God, that makes me so anxious. Like, please don't tell me to live life to the fullest. Like I once wrote a blog post on my blog. I called it The Anxieties of a Beautiful Day. And it was like, because I live in Colorado and we have beautiful weather out here all the time. It's amazing. Beautiful views, beautiful weather. It's kind of just mind blowing. And I feel anxious all the time when it's a beautiful day. I'm like, why do I feel so anxious? And I'm like, because I know. Maybe it's because of social media. Maybe it's just my brain. Something's telling me, you aren't making use of this beautiful day. You're just sitting at home. The sun is shining. The clock is ticking. What are you doing? And you feel anxious. And I'm like, why am I feeling anxious? It's a beautiful day. You're feeling anxious because some part of your mind is telling you, man, you need to use this beautiful day. You got to do something with it. And that feeling, I think, is a cultural curse or a gift or a blessing. I don't know what to call it. But our culture tells us we have to use things and we have to use them well and we have to use them to some end, right? So me, my life, my time has to be used for something. It has to result in something. This makes us terribly anxious.
I agree. I agree so much. Well, I want to read the sentence from your book, which I think is so beautiful. Anxiety appears to be a universal, perennial human condition, one that remains despite the impressive onward march of well-funded empirical philosophy, pharmacology, and neuropsychology, an equally impressively mysterious phenomenon, one not easily accommodated in and by scientific paradigms and frameworks. I mean, there's so many good things you say in this book. Anxiety is frightening. Anxiety is a frightening reminder we are complex beings, not easily resolved into the atoms of our favorite theories. Love that. As we will soon see, while this attitude towards anxiety distinguishes Buddhism from existentialist treatment, they will significantly agree that what causes anxiety is not acute conscious or sublimated awareness of our death, our mortality, our finite life, our decidedly human constraints and constitutive conditions. We must not shy away from anxiety. We must not shy away from anxiety. How can we embrace anxiety then? How can we come?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I think one is, when we feel anxious, I think we have a desire to not feel anxious very quickly. And I think one thing is that Paul Tillich talks about how we should try to make our anxieties into fears by making them more concrete. Fear of something that's formless, something that's nothing. So perhaps if I think a little bit about my anxiety, if I try to actually hold that feeling and stay close to it, and I know what I'm describing is a maneuver that's hard to describe, but the best way to describe is to not try to push that thought away, to face up to the thought, to let the anxiety infect your being, and to maybe think about what might be making you anxious. What could it be? And sometimes it might crystallize onto a distinct object, right? And I think that process, it's not easy. Sometimes it can happen to us while we meditate. Sometimes it can, the toughest part is that it actually happens when you have an anxiety attack. I mean, that's like really hard to do. And I think some of the messages or some of the techniques that people have for dealing with anxiety attacks can help you remain centered. But I think the best thing is, or I think the best way to describe this is that you're not trying to run away from the feeling. You're trying to face up with it. You're trying to experience it. You may be even trying to wallow in it. And you're hoping that that proximity to that feeling makes it concrete. So for example, sometimes this can be done therapeutically. I'm feeling anxious. What could you be feeling anxious about? Or I'm apprehensive about this thing happening, right? It becomes concrete at that point. But that high level fear can actually be bottoming out in some very basement level anxiety. So, for example, my fear of losing my job, right? Like, why are you so freaked out about losing your job? Well, if I really push you hard enough, it's maybe because you're scared, not just because this will show you up to be a poor bread earner and as a result, the loss of masculine identity, but also concretely because it means the loss of your health insurance. And why is the loss of health insurance a problem? Well, in a country like ours, if I was to lose my financial cover for treatment, that would mean possibly, a fatal disease or something that's not curable. And there's that fear of death, right? So I do think there is what I call basement dwelling anxiety, which is the fear of death. And I think fear of the loss of love. And maybe even in some ways, fear of death is even a kind of fear of loss of love, because I do know that when I die, I will lose not just all that I love, but all those who love me will lose my love. Death is a very profound loss of love. I think when I get scared of death, what I really think about is not nothingness, but I imagine myself to be alone, just alone in some very cosmic, cold, dark sky. And I'm alone and I'm naked and I'm unprotected and I'm alone, alone, alone. I think that's what scares me about death. I think if I was to just not be conscious, I think I would be fine because I'm familiar with sleep and I'm used to that kind of unconsciousness. But the idea of being alone is very frightening, right? So I think to back up a little bit to your original question, I think to sit with anxiety is to hope that you can turn the anxiety into a fear. And that fear tells you something about what you treasure, what you cherish, what you care for. And so you realize something about where, in some ways, these keys to your being exist. Like, I know for a fact that my wife and my daughter are the most important things for me. And the deepest of my anxieties I have are a concern about how my daughter will grow up, concern that nothing happened to her. For my wife, and, for my immediate extended family, my brother, my sister-in-law, my nephew, his wife, those. So I learned something about my values. I learned something about my structure of hierarchies, about what I care for, in a kind of knowledge that is not verbal. It's an experiential, non-verbal, felt knowledge. And I think this is why sometimes I can learn something intellectually and yet not feel it. I think forgiving is a very good example. Like, I can sometimes forgive someone rationally and say, oh, okay, it's okay, I forgive you. But I still carry around residues of anger because I haven't made that emotional connection yet. So I think it's similarly with anxieties. I know, on the face of it, someone could superficially say, you are a parent and you care about your children. But anxiety makes me experience that love.
Wow, this is so profound. I cannot tell you how moved I am, how touched, and it's just it blows my mind when you put it in such eloquent language. I mean, I can comment on and making your anxieties more concrete. I can give a specific example from my life recently. I was scared of doing colonoscopy. And for 2 years, I postponed it and I didn't want to do it. But the moment I scheduled it, my anxiety vanished because it was very concrete and the day was coming and I could worry about the concrete thing in front of me. Before that, it was this amorphous, chaotic vortex, cosmos kind of anxiety that would grip me and I would be worried for 2 unnecessary years, right? But the moment I made it concrete, it was very manageable. So I agree with that. I just realized that recently, like a week ago, made that connection. And it's so interesting how you connect the anxiety to our values and that embodied knowing. When you allow yourself to drop into that and feel that, it reveals your values to you, the things that are important to you. But so many of us are so scared to even tap into that pool of awareness or knowing, right?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And I think this goes back, I think, partially to to that earlier remark I made about the kind of mythologies of life that instruct us that we have to run away from unpleasant things, that we have to avoid unpleasantness, and maybe sometimes, and I think, philosophers through the ages have known this, that through difficulty, through challenge, through unpleasantness lies the pathway to knowledge, to learning. And it allows us, I say this in the final pages of the book, we are so used to thinking of ourselves as being such ordinary creatures, and we are. But there is also something extraordinary about us. Each one of us. We are creatures who are possessed with the knowledge of their own destruction, of their own finiteness. And we live with this knowledge for our entire period of our existence. That alone, I think, should qualify us for some self-respect. We live with this knowledge of our own destruction, and yet every day in the morning, we get up and we get on with it.
Yeah. You quote Pema Chodron in the book too. The central question is not how we avoid uncertainty and feel, but how we relate to discomfort. Speaking to your earlier point, with practice, we learn to stay with the nameless fear. That nameless fear. Oh man.
She's very perceptive. Those remarks really jumped out to me. I was like, oh my God, she's talking about anxiety in this really beautiful, effective way. So I actually found her book very valuable, and I felt like I could have accepted the entire book, but I was like, okay, let me just, come up with a few gems from it and include it as quotes.
And the last one is, we fear losing our illusion of security. That's what makes us anxious. We fear being confused and not knowing which way to turn. So true.
Yeah. And I think, it's also the anticipation of future unpleasantness, right? Which makes us anxious. Like, I know that something bad is going to happen to me in 5 years' time or 5 months' time. And so I start anticipating that unpleasantness, and that anticipation itself is a kind of anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Moreover, once we accept that anxiety is inevitable, we may spend less time fighting it and simply wait for the wave to wash over us. Its very familiarity may be its own best antidote. Just like so good.
Yes, thank you. I actually thought of that because there's a kind of physical sensation that I feel when I go out in the mornings for long hikes or climbs or things like that. And it's a very peculiar kind of sensation that kicks in once I've started hiking. It's a combination of nausea and fear, and it possesses me. It's a particular kind of nausea that possesses my body for about 2 minutes, I would say. Nausea and fear, there's no other way to describe it. And I have almost grown to recognize it. It's like, here it comes. And it's just like, and I think that's why I use the analogy of the wave washing over us. When the wave washes over you, you just hang on to the rock and it comes and you just wait. You just wait for the wave to wash, and finally, the water level will recede at some point. And that's how I describe it. There's nothing I can do about it. Here it comes. Hang on tight. And it sucks. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's horrible. Just hang in there. Just wait. It will go away. It seems interminable when it's happening, but it's almost like I've like grown to know it. And it's me. It always happens every single time. Whenever I set the alarm in the morning and the alarm goes off in the dark, I feel horrible. When it's in these anxiety-filled moments when I know I'm going out to do something possibly dangerous. But like I said, its familiarity is its antidote. It's going to happen.
Would you say you made peace with it, you made friends with it, or you became familiar with it? What other ways you might describe it?
Yeah, those are all really good descriptions. Familiarity, making peace with it, an acceptance of it. There's this phrase that I use as a kind of epigraph in the opening part of the book. I have a few quotes that serve as epigraphs. And one of them is from the existential psychotherapist, Irving Yalom. And he says, the purpose of therapy is to help us reconstrue that which we cannot alter, right? So if there is something that I know I cannot change, and yet it is a problem for me, then the only maneuver I've got left to me is to understand it differently, is to interpret it differently. And in so doing, give it a different identity, right? If it is thing that, because you only really have 3 options for any kind of problematic situation you find yourself in. Either you escape, right? So if you take existence as a problem, escape is always possible. You could, as Camus said, you could consider suicide, right? And there are people who take that option out of existence. Right. The second is that you could be an activist. You could try to change existence. You could be a political activist. You can be a relational activist. You can be an emotional activist. You can try and change things about yourself or the world. But if neither of those 2 options are available to you, if you're not going to leave, if you're not going to be able to change the things that cause you a problem, then you only have one option: understand it differently, reconceptualize it, recognize it. And literally, it can become a different thing, right? When you look at it differently, it becomes a different thing. And that is a philosophical maneuver. That is a cognitive maneuver. That's not me changing anything about the world, right? It's like when I think, all these examples that exist in the Buddhist and Jain traditions about the rope and the snake, right? I see the rope, I think it's a snake, I get freaked out, I get scared, I start throwing things at it, right? My heart rate goes up, my hair stands up. Then I put on the light and it's like, so it's a rope. All right. So my pulse goes down, right? I see it differently. It's no longer a threat, right? Nothing has changed in the world, but my illumination of the object that was the focus of my attention has changed. So because I know something different about it, because I see it from a different light, it has a different identity. And I think that's kind of what I've been trying to do with anxiety in this book. That if you think about all these ways in which people have understood anxiety and you understand anxiety's relationship to the conditions of our existence, then you come to understand you're the kind of thing that is primed to be anxious, and anxious in different ways. There's a different kind of anxiety as a teenager or as a lover or as a parent or as an old person, all these stages, but they will keep coming in different forms. That's why I use that example in the beginning of my book. I used to be anxious about the life I was going to live. Now I'm anxious about the life I have lived. Did I live it correctly? I don't know. But I'm also pretty sure I'm pretty sure there's no one placed in charge of examining my life. Nobody's going to give me a grade for this. That is something that I'm pretty sure about. I can stop worrying about the great examiner who's going to say, well, Samir, let's go over your life and see what you got done and what you didn't. I think that is something I'm starting to become pretty comfortable with, the idea that I'm not going to get examined. There's no final exam waiting for me. That I'm pretty sure.
I want to read something again. You write, after my mother passed away, a fundamental crisis overcame me. I realized that I was free as never before. I really want you to talk about that freedom. What do you mean by that freedom?
I think the best thing is to say that when you are being brought up by your parents, there's a certain set of expectations on you on how to live your life. You want to make them happy. You want to come up to their standards. And it's not just performance, but they have given you a model. When they go away, I think some of that, there is a kind of underwriting. Like it's almost like there was a contract I had with the world. You do these things and you get to enjoy existence with your parents. When my parents went away, I felt like the contract had been torn up. So that itself felt like I was freed from certain kinds of contractual obligations. I suddenly didn't know what shape my life was supposed to take because these underwriters of my life were no longer there, right? So I really felt like I had been pushed out into the void with no directions now on what to do. And I realized that, there was concern for me that my parents had that inhibited me. Right? For instance, you couldn't take certain kinds of risks. I couldn't take certain kinds of career decisions, perhaps. Perhaps I couldn't date certain kind of women, or I couldn't do drugs, or whatever it was. And I suddenly realized that all of that was gone. I could literally do anything. But I also realized that my parents' concern had also infected me with a certain concern for myself. Like they had taught me prudence and care. And I realized that also wasn't around anymore. And so I really felt like I could do anything, but that anything included good and bad. I could be a criminal. I could, most frighteningly and most scarily, I could kill myself because my mother wouldn't have to grieve me. There was quite literally a kind of frightening door that was opened. Like I felt like a door opened and I could look into it, and it was like anything was possible in this world. There was also something, like that. There's that line in Dostoevsky where he says, if God doesn't exist, anything is possible. And I also had this feeling like, wow, this is proof of the non-existence of God. So that was a very, very frightening metaphysical moment where I felt like, oh shit, anything could happen. Like this just literally, like I could be, it's like my mind could conjure up any possibility. So both in terms of what I could do and what could happen to me, everything suddenly became unrestricted. And I think that was truly, truly, truly terrifying, because I think we have grown up believing things that our parents have told us, that the world is ruled by certain kinds of laws, man-made laws, religious laws, natural laws. We keep hearing about laws as we grow up, and we realize that it's a kind of cover-up. It's an attempt to give a happy face to how brutal and difficult things are. And I think I felt it especially with my mother, because I think in my father's case, I think I'd basically told myself like, oh, this bad thing was going to happen to me, and it's happened. So now nothing will happen. I think that's why I use that expression. I paid my tax, I paid the admission price. They're not going to ask me again. But when my mom passed away, when my mom was threatened, I was like, there's actually nothing that can not happen. And Kierkegaard has this line where he says, if you let your mind become educated by possibility, you will learn to give thanks for what has been realized in your favor. And when you really think of all that is possible, I do feel relieved. I'm like, wow, actually, I have it pretty good. I did lose my parents, but I do have a beautiful wife and a beautiful daughter and friends who love me, and I have family who loves me. And I saw a beautiful sunrise this morning. So you're like, wow, there's a lot that could go wrong, and there's a lot that's in my favor. And, that's a very, that itself is a pretty empowering realization. And I think it's a journey through loss and through grief that makes you aware of your blessings in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I am acutely aware of that every day. Every day, like the simplest little things. I experienced the earthquake, right? In like 12 seconds, you lose everything. And so that this force to live and enjoy every moment and be amazed by simple and little things. He gave me so much joy every day. And people, like, it's hard to explain. I am sometimes amazed by myself, like I don't take people for granted. The people I meet on my path, the people I work with, neighbors, everybody. It's like such a privilege to meet people and know them and be touched by humans, small things and big things, like a little rock that I may see on my path, or, a smile of a child who is playing outside. Like everything gives me enormous joy. And I am acutely aware of it, and I pay attention to things. And people always comment, they're like, how do you remember that? I'm like, I pay attention to those little details that are not. So I was at the meeting. We went to this workshop with the two friends. I went to this workshop recently in February, vision board making workshop. It's a workshop that it's like maybe 12 people. No one knows one another. You're never going to see these people again. You're there just for a workshop. Everybody went around and introduced themselves. I look at everyone, they say their name. I try to think something about them, right? Like that woman's name is Julie. And then at the end, everybody was joking. Somebody says, oh, you probably don't even know our names, right? It was a great time. I said, no, I remember everyone's name. And I really recited all 12 people's names. And they were like, wow, well, how do you remember? I'm like, I don't know. Like when I meet someone, it's this pleasure, is this privilege of if it's a random person, like it's still something for me. And I think that's part of the same package for me, this acute awareness of life, its impermanence and enjoyment and awe and wonder and fear and anxiety, all of it.
Yeah, I think there was a word that was coming to mind as you were saying this, and I think of it as receptivity or a kind of sensitivity. There was a podcast I heard once between Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert. They were talking grief.
Oh, I love that. I've listened to that episode twice.
Yeah, there's a couple of really wise remarks that Colbert makes in that about how that this grief is something he's grateful for because it has actually allowed him to experience life to its fullest, to feel things that he would not have otherwise felt, to have a particular relationship to this world. And I think that really captures it quite well for what I feel. I think in the end, I am grateful for this receptivity. I'm grateful for this sensitivity. I feel that my enjoyment, there's no other word for it, of music, of literature, of drama, of art, of the love that I have in my life is enhanced by this loss that I've experienced. So it's hard for me to say this. And I think this is probably the hardest thing I've ever had to say in my life to myself or to anybody. But in the end, yeah, that even this losses that I've suffered, I've come to accept them and package them into my sense of what my life is because those losses allow me to have the love that I have now.
So true. So deep and profound.
And so if I want the love that I have now, then I must also accept that loss, that I cannot have one
I know.
without the other.
I know. Like when I'm having an experience, I'm also mourning that experience sometimes. I told like on the podcast before, like I went to my cousin's wedding. I'm dancing with my family, my old aunt and my relatives. And I know this might be the last time that I see them alive. And that gives me that sadness. But it also makes this moment so rich that I want to throw myself in it and experience the immense alive, vibrant potency of it,
Yeah, I'm talking to you at a very potent time in my emotional well-being because I've just returned from a trip to India. I just came back on Sunday night and I've been crying. I was crying at the airport, I was crying at the hotel, I've been crying at home, just missing. I don't know how many times I will see them. They're so far. And I look back on the photographs and I know every single second is just taking us forward, forward, forward towards the end of it all. And all our lives are fragile. And it just made those moments so full. And even now, when I look back on those photographs, my heart breaks. It's so hard for me to take it all in. My daughter often says, like, wow, Baba, you like cry a lot. And I always say it's great. It's awesome. I love crying. I watch movies and I listen to music. And it's just, I said, I just feel and relate to everything better. It's a kind of painful experience, but I don't think I'd give it up.
I agree. I'm the same way. I'm the same way. Wow. I feel so seen by your book and by your company and by speaking with you. And it just normalizes my experiences. And I hope there are listeners out there who can relate to it. It's such an honor and delight to speak with you. I will return to this book again and again. It's such an inspiring text, It's like I highlighted so many things. And, of course, there is your story, but it changed how I view anxiety, for sure. It changed how I view anxiety, how I approach it. And I am a lot less anxious of anxiety now because of it.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I feel seen and I feel vindicated myself. I often told my wife that, if I hear from people that reading the book was good for them, it means a lot to me. We always, as authors, we're always keen to get good reviews and good sales and all that kind of stuff. I got a pretty unkind review in the Wall Street Journal. It's the first published review. It made me pretty upset because it's one of these sort of condescending reviews. It's not a bad book, but it's off the mark in all these ways, and I felt like it was a bit unkind. And then I got your email and I was like, oh wow, but actually some person related to it and they connected with it, and that makes it all worthwhile. So thank you. And I hope that that other people read it and that, they find something in it that makes them feel seen or, heard or whatever the appropriate case may be. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much. It was quite moving. Thank you. You definitely got me. You definitely got me to emote a bit today, which is fine. I like being open and vulnerable in these ways. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's my superpower. No, I'm kidding. Thank you so much. I really, really treasured this conversation. I'm going to go back when it releases and listen to it, because you learned so many new things when you listen to it again.
Thanks.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What are some of your ahas from this conversation? Did you learn something new about anxiety? I have done several episodes on the topic of anxiety. I will have links to those episodes in the show notes. I hope you will give it a listen, or if you have listened before, maybe you can re-listen and rediscover new things. I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, there is a free tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you love the podcast and find it helpful, consider making a donation. Your support is extremely important. It helps us stay on air, produce episodes on a regular basis uninterruptedly, and cover the many costs associated with the creation of the podcast. To learn more and make a donation, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Another way to show your support is to rate the show on Spotify or write a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to the show. Be sure to follow the show wherever podcasts are played in order not to miss upcoming episodes. And if you want to connect with your fellow listeners, join us in our private Facebook group, the Authentic Parenting Community. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.